Hi there. This is a cast iron fluted cake pan made by Lodge Cast Iron in 2018, only 3 years ago. And this is a vintage cast iron cake pan, probably made at some time in the early 20th century. Because of the shape of these pans, anyone today would call these Bundt cake pans, but that's actually not correct. But because the Bundt pan is so popular, people simply name a cake pan with this shape as a Bundt pan. Here's a look at some of the cast iron pans made since long before the Bundt pan arrived, even as much as 100 years before. These fancy cake pans were especially popular in Europe during the 1700s and 1800s, and a lot of these pans were made in Austria and Germany and given the name of Gugelhof to describe their circular shape and fancy design. A number of these pans are still in existence today, and some of them have gate marks on the bottom indicating they were made during the 19th century. World War II devastated Europe, especially Germany, which is why we see very few, if any, of these pans from modern-day manufacturers, though some of these pans were made in France for some time. Cast iron cake pans from Europe have some very elaborate shapes, and there are many names for these pans based on their designs, including the Dolman, the Cyclone, and the Triple Crown series, including the King and the Monarch. These cakes and these pans were far more popular in Europe than the United States in those days, though major cast iron manufacturers in the USA, including Wagner and Griswold, did make cake pans in this style. Because Griswold cast iron has become highly valuable among antique collectors, the Griswold cast iron cake pan can be seen on eBay and other auction sites, always with a price that is beyond belief. American-made cast iron cake pans have only used this traditional shape, though American manufacturers also make cake molds in other shapes, especially the lamb cake mold, the rabbit, and Santa Claus. Meanwhile, the reason why these are called Bundt pans is because of Nordic Ware, even though Nordic never made a cast iron cake pan. In 1950, they invented the name Bundt and trademarked it for their own aluminum cake pan, and then in 1966 a cake called the Tunnel of Fudge came in second place in the annual Pillsbury Bake-Off competition, and even though this cake was only in second place, it spread like wildfire and became the hottest food fad seen in the country in a long time. The popularity of the Bundt pan exploded, and it's continued to this very day, and because of this, folks today refer to any circular-shaped baking pan as a Bundt pan, and this has also applied to cast iron cake pans as well. Lodge began making its own cast iron fluted cake pan in the 1960s. They produced this pan as late as the 1990s, but in 2001 they discontinued production of this pan. And when Lodge stopped making it, it turned out that no one else was making cast iron Bundt pans either. Wagner and Griswold had stopped making cast iron cake pans decades before, and the only other American maker of these pans was, in fact, the John Wright Company of Pennsylvania. They had briefly made a cast iron cake pan during the 1980s, but in far smaller numbers than Lodge. So when the Lodge fluted cake pan was discontinued, no one at all had made any cast iron cake pans in a very long time. Asian makers had never made them, and even European manufacturers had stopped making them decades earlier. An enameled cast iron cake pan had been made in France for a period of time, but that was it. No one was making these pans, and the cast iron cake pan became extremely rare. And then in the 21st century, a new cast iron renaissance began, and cast iron suddenly exploded in popularity in a manner that hadn't been seen in generations. Of course, this caused prices for these vintage cake pans to skyrocket, and a cast iron Bundt pan became the holy grail for many collectors and sellers. If you thought Griswold cast iron was expensive, that was nothing compared to what you could end up paying for a cast iron Bundt pan. For many people, the only way to acquire one of these pans was to be incredibly lucky and discover one at an estate sale or antique store that didn't know how valuable this pan was. But this situation changed in 2018 when Lodge reintroduced its cast iron fluted cake pan nearly 2 decades after they had stopped production of this pan. The fluted cake pan was the first of the Legacy series from Lodge, and they produced this pan for a full year before discontinuing it again at the end of 2019. Many people were thrilled to finally be able to purchase a brand new cast iron cake pan for the first time, though it took longer than Lodge anticipated for them to completely sell out of the fluted cake pan. The new cast iron cake pan did give one good result, as it caused the outrageously expensive market for cast iron cake pans to reduce prices to a somewhat more affordable level. Today, the new Lodge fluted cake pans have been sold out once again for about a year, and if you want your own cast iron cake pan, once again it's very difficult to find one. There's one other alternative available at this time. One Asian manufacturer produced a cast iron cake pan to cash in on the situation, and these pans have been sold at agri-supply stores in the area of the southeastern United States. And best of all, this cake pan will give you a beautiful and delicious cake that will be the centerpiece of any dessert. Now that we've seen the history of this cake pan, let's put it through its paces and make a chocolate fudge cake. This is a cast iron cake pan that was probably made in Europe during the 20th century. It doesn't have any specific markings, so it can't be dated any more exact than that, though its design is what collectors call the Monarch, part of the Triple Crown series. It's nearly a full inch smaller than the Lodge fluted cake pan, but it certainly won't have any trouble making a full-sized cake. I'm very fond of a technique where we place the dry cake pan into the oven without any grease or oil, and we preheat the oven and the pan to 425 degrees Fahrenheit. That sounds like a high temperature for a cake, but this is intentional, as you'll see in a bit. While the cake is heating in the pan, we mix the dry ingredients together. This is going to be a fudge cake, so it uses brown sugar rather than white sugar. Otherwise, the ingredients are very basic, but be sure to whisk the dry ingredients to add air. Once this is done, we set up the mixer and start adding the wet ingredients. And that simply includes 3 eggs, a cup of Greek yogurt, and a cup of hot black coffee to enhance the deep chocolate flavor. After adding vegetable oil and vanilla extract, we mix it all together and our cake batter is ready. Now the hot cake pan comes out of the oven and we melt a tablespoon of Crisco. Use a basting brush to cover every inch of the pan because this is what will keep the cake from sticking. We mix the extra oil into the cake batter, then we pour the batter into the hot cake pan. And with that, it goes into the oven. And as soon as the cake is in the oven, we turn down the temperature to 350 degrees. This will cause the oven temperature to decrease as the cake bakes. And because this is a slightly smaller cake pan, we bake it for 40 minutes. Once the cake is out of the oven, we let it rest for 20 minutes. And while the cake is still hot, it's time to flip it and remove the cake pan. I just said it's the moment of truth once again. All right. This pan is slightly smaller than the Lodge pan, which should make this a little bit easier to flip, I hope. And there we go. All we can do now is give it a try. A 1, a 2, a 3. Ha-ha! We have success! This looks pretty darn good, if I may say so. And all we need to do now is decorate the cake with a light dusting of powdered sugar. That's all we need because the cake itself is so attractive. And here is our finished chocolate fudge cake, baked in the Monarch, a vintage cast iron cake pan. And today, in the year 2021, these cast iron pans are still extremely rare, and for some collectors, finding a pan like this is almost as exciting as finding the Holy Grail. But these pans are out there, and the only advice I can give is to keep looking, because you can still get lucky and find a treasure like this. And it's definitely worth it to own a cast iron cake pan because you can use it to bake a beautiful and wonderful cake that your friends and family will all admire. And that's one of the joys of cooking and baking in cast iron, because not only are you making a cake that looks delicious and it's wonderful to look at, you're also cooking with a piece of history. These cake pans have a fascinating history, and the feeling of revealing a cake made with this antique cake pan is one that makes it all worthwhile. It's a lot of fun to use, and I hope you've enjoyed watching this little bit of history. Have fun hunting for cast iron, and especially have fun cooking. Thank you for watching.